Hello, and welcome to the Bit of a Tangent podcast, where we bring you mind-bending ideas from science, philosophy, artificial intelligence, medicine, and more. I'm Jared, a medical student and aspiring rationalist, and as always, I'll be joined by my co-host Gianluca, data wizard, learning machine, and contender for the most quantified self. In this episode, we depart on a number of conversational tangents, including our favorite productivity strategies and the different schools of productivity thought, some techniques we've tried to raise our awareness and prevent lapsing into repetitive, unconscious, and unhelpful ways of being, the conversations with people we love we may never have, but probably should, activities that get neglected unless you specifically schedule them in, and the notion of a space of things or concepts and what it means to close the inferential distance between these concepts. Along the way, we hit a not unusual amount of tangents, so there's plenty to keep you intrigued. And so, without further ado, here's the episode of Bit of a Tangent.
I have a bed. I can sleep on something that modern man has been sleeping on for years now. I'm part of humanity again.
So you've been sleeping on a mattress up until this point on the floor, or no mattress at all?
No mattress, just floor.
Okay. So you got a mattress pretty quickly. So, I mean, like a mattress on the floor is pretty reasonable. Quite nice, actually.
No, I had no mattress.
You had no mattress. So you've been sleeping on the hard ground for, what, a week? Two weeks?
2 weeks, although I won't make it sound worse than it was, because it was only the hard ground for, let's say, 7 days total, and then I rolled up some towels, and then Sasha has like this sort of camping mat, which I borrowed, which has been fairly comfortable. I have no complaints with it.
Okay. So, yeah, but pretty, I don't know, stoic, I think.
I will say, I think my yeah, no, maybe. But I think, interestingly, my spine feels as good as it's ever felt. It was my hips that suffered, but my spine felt great.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I also do find, like, sometimes just lying on hard surfaces just is so nice for your back. Because a lot of the time, like, soft beds just allow us to contort and be tensed in all the ways that we are normally throughout the course of the day from all our sitting and slouching. So it's actually quite nice to just lie down, especially if you can get your legs up. That said, sleeping a whole night like that, I tend to roll onto my side, and at that point the pelvis takes the brunt. So yeah, but have you found it like mentally or psychologically? Have you found it a positive or negative experience, or neutral?
Maybe even slightly positive, I guess. There was definitely a noticeable change in being much closer to the floor. That sort of, I'm going to use the word grounded, non-ironically now. But there's something to be said for this like very minimalist style of lying down, almost bedding down each night. And it certainly wasn't something that I was going to complain about. I found it really the least of the unpleasantries that one has felt is left to deal with in everyday life.
Okay, well, it's pretty reassuring to hear. I think that's like, yeah, ultimately it like, is this the condition I so feared? Is the Stoic mantra, and yeah, I think it's quite nice every now and then. Yeah, it's like one of those things, like watching the sunrise, that you should do at least once, but maybe a few times a year.
That very idea is something I've been writing about a little bit this week. So like certain activities which get neglected easily just by the pattern and shape and dynamics of everyday life, but which are things that are worth scheduling in, I guess is the catchphrase. Because they're so easy to neglect, yet add so much.
So there's this interesting idea, it comes from one of the productivity sort of gurus. These are the classic sort of schools of productivity. You've got the getting things done people and so on. The names are all, kind of trivial. But one of the schools was that you should schedule the things that you most easily put off, delay, or avoid first, and then let all the other commitments surround that. What's that?
It's sort of like you should eat your frogs first, almost.
Except eating your frog is more about like tackling the hardest challenge. But this was more in the sense, because I remember these were listed somewhere, and the eat your frog sort of school was separated from this one. So it's more the leisure and social activities and things, this self reflection, the sharpening of the saw, if you will. So it's scheduling those activities first, because the eat your frog thing works quite well. But if you're a workaholic, your problem is not so much that you're sure you're putting off some things through acrasia, but the challenge can also be not spending enough time on things that are important outside of just working. You can just tunnel vision on work, and that's also a problem. So the idea being that you would schedule in your exercise and your social plans and your date nights and your weekends away with friends for like months in advance first, and then let work and other commitments and things fill fill the gaps in between, as opposed to the inverse, which is sort of the natural state. It ties back into that of there are certain things like doing quarterly and yearly reviews that aren't the default and not difficult, but they have incredible value, and it's important to try and schedule them, and you have to use various tools and tactics and sort of hacks to try and increase the likelihood that you do them promptly and regularly, because when you've done them, you always go, wow, that was so valuable, I should do that more often. And then it becomes this issue of time goes by, it's spread out enough that it isn't a habit, but yet it's important enough that it is something you have to try and make time to do. It's something I've really struggled with at the moment, because I've been I still haven't done my yearly review because I had other commitments that were more urgent and more important in the sort of traditional sense. And so I keep neglecting this thing, and I kind of feel like I haven't really started my year properly yet because I don't have this clear overview of it.
I guess that makes me think of, you could almost categorize events quite naturally into these two broad categories of either, I guess, what you could call naturally space filling. So that's things like social media use and work in the traditional sense. You almost don't need to schedule it, right? It just permeates and expands like some gaseous thing into every nook and cranny of your time, right? If
Absolutely.
You don't have to tell me, use WhatsApp for 20 minutes today, I will just find 20 minutes. But you could say to a lot of people, and myself included on some days, okay, find 20 minutes to meditate, and I'll say, I don't know where to find it, right? So that could actually, that's an interesting distinction. I quite like that. We need to figure out a catchy name for those two groups of events.
Yeah, while we think about that, I think an important way to cluster them away from each other quite easily, because not all of the my first thought was that all of the gaseous expanding ones are designed to be that way. So like social media is a good example, right? Because it's designed to hack your attention. So a lot of thought and energy and man and woman hours have gone into them. But that's not always the case. I mean, I think like something like WhatsApp, you can do WhatsApp almost anytime, anywhere, but you can't meditate anytime, anywhere. And I think that's also why finding time for meditation is hardest of all things, because you can, sort of find some moments here and there when there's noise or whatever to read a few articles or, listen to an audiobook. But meditation requires for the most part, requires quite precise conditions. And so I think, generally these things can be clustered into the sort of the ones that you can naturally just do anywhere, and ones and any time, and ones that require specific conditions that are easy to put off, right? You can't go for a run if you're not in running shoes.
Okay, yeah, I see that distinction. Although I must say, I would push back a little bit on the idea that you can't do meditation. In some sense, right? Mindfulness is meant to be brought out into just the world that you find yourself in. So maybe that specific example is not as close.
I will totally grant you that the practice of mindfulness can be an anytime thing. Those sort of resolving to be conscious in any given moment, or focusing the attention. But in a way, that's more like the effect of the meditation and not the cause as much to me. But if we throw aside the actual, the true, Platonic ideal of the meditation, or maybe I shouldn't say the Platonic ideal, I misput as the Sam Harris ideal of meditation, then, if you just think of standard headspace, 10 minutes, sit quietly, close your eyes, listen to the audio, that kind of meditation, that requires specific conditions. It actually was a bit of a bad example, but I suppose everything is a bad example if you find, that people know enough about it, and have the time to. But yeah.
I actually wanted to ask then, maybe just tangentially here. So in terms of your own mindfulness practice and this general goal of bringing mindfulness out into just the everyday, do you have any sort of ways of trying to do that? So, I mean, as you said, ideally it's just every moment of consciousness, but I think for most people, and certainly for myself, that's just a long way away right now. So are there any specific triggers or anything that you use or habits you're trying to bring out on that?
Nothing's jumping to mind. I think when I notice myself feeling particularly anxious, especially the physiological symptoms of anxiety, so I notice I'll be tapping my foot, or I'll be very physically tensed up, in terms of my musculature, then I will often, as a result, take one deep or two deep mindful breaths and kind of just bring myself into the moment. So no closing of the eyes, nothing, just focus on the breath and being present in the now for two deep breaths. And, just the breathing alone, I think there's some evidence to suggest that alone would help. But, that sometimes helps, just to take the edge off if there's actually quite intense anxiety. But yeah, I suppose you could make more explicit triggers. So for people who are trying to learn to lucid dream, they have tricks where they'll write something on the back of their hand or something of that nature, that when they notice, they use it to realize, to remind themselves that they're awake, so that when they're sleeping, they are in the habit of looking at the hand and seeing, and then they see it's not there, they realize they're actually asleep, and then try not to wake up, and that's how they induce lucid dreaming. One could apply a similar sort of thing by wearing a certain piece of jewelry on the wrist, or having something on one's hand, and every time you notice that, to stop and be mindful. However, that has the problem of you tend to stop noticing those things because they don't stand out after a while. So you'd have to keep changing it.
I like your idea. I like your idea of linking or just trying to notice a specific physiological or psychological phenomenon. One that I've tried, or two maybe, is I've tried to use eating and food as a trigger to just pause for a second, because it's obviously a very rich sensory experience, and I'm trying less and less to just scoff whatever it is in front of me and actually use that as a trigger to pay attention. Ironically, of course, I'm telling you this 10 minutes after virtually inhaling some scrambled eggs before we started recording. So
that's it's a sacrifice for the cause, and not all heroes wear capes, but some of them scarf down scrambled eggs.
And then another one that I'm also trying, and this one has actually been surprisingly successful, is I've tried to use the appearance of human faces as a trigger. So I think Sam Harris does a really good job of explaining this, but just how when human gaze, the look of someone else's eyes implicates you as a self, right? There's something it feels like to be looked at. And that feeling is distinct enough that I'm trying to create this sense of, okay, I'm being looked at and now notice that. So that's been interesting, and it certainly led me to, at least the times that I managed to do it, just be slightly more aware that there is this whole other person behind that face, which is maybe something that I need reminding of. But
another consciousness with a whole universe of their own existing inside their simulation. I mean, on that, I find it's actually quite interesting to notice how seldom you actually make proper eye contact with people, like just anyone. Like sometimes you can go through a whole day having meetings, conversations, and various social interactions without ever really having proper eye contact and paying attention. It's almost just like these things are, voices playing out, or, you might as well be interacting with them over like a Slack chat. I find particularly in with colleagues as opposed to friends or partners.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's quite an interesting thing to, and it's incredibly powerful to stop and look another person in the eyes for 5 to 10 seconds and really pay attention to them and what they're saying and what and it's the height of empathy in many ways.
It's certainly more challenging than you think, at least if you start out having relatively poor habits. And it's something that when you try, it can either go, I found, like surprisingly well or surprisingly badly. It goes badly if you just project very bad, evolutionarily conserved challenge behavior and posturing. And that can just happen if you are just maybe, let's say, in a rush. But it can also go surprisingly well. Yesterday was a very good example of this. I was at the till at the supermarket, and just everything about my affect just came off well, surprisingly so. In fact, it was so surprising because I noticed that person's demeanor change in real time, and this is a function of maybe my tone of voice. And it was honestly, it was asking that person, how are you, but in a tone of voice that wasn't the same one as, I'm here, put my stuff through the machine, and how are you, because that is like the next sentence in the script. It obviously sounded at least realistic enough, and there was a real-time shift in her demeanor, and it was very interesting.
Yeah, that's very, very cool. I've actually just remembered I have this game that I try and play as much as possible, which is whenever you encountering someone who's having lots of social contacts but very few interactions in a day, so a cashier is a perfect example, or some kind of teller or whatever, to try and be one of the most or the most warm connections that person has on that day, regardless of how you're feeling. So you might feel like dog shit and you might not want to talk to this person, and you might be like irritated about something, but to just actually add more to them than because if you're just taking away constantly, and especially those people like in toll booths and things like that will really, really respond to that, because a lot of the time what they get is just irritation, and the person just ignores them.
Yeah, that's actually a really good one.
It's a good skill to practice, so it works both ways as well.
On this topic, there's another sort of practice which I've been thinking about. We're sort of talking about different things we do to bring ourselves into the world and out of our heads. And I can't remember exactly where I was turned on to this, but the idea is to make almost, let's say, door frames or entrances and exits a trigger to try and summarize whatever just happened to you in that room that you're in, or that space. And this came up in the context of, so imagine spaced repetition for a book or something else you wanted to learn, but now your spaced repetition or just a little bit of reminding of your life. And so it's just a way to make sure that you are tightening the feedback loops that comprise your interactions, right? It's if you are summarizing an interaction every 10 minutes that you leave, it's going to be difficult not to notice when you've been a colossal dick, for example. So that's very intriguing to me.
It's a pretty clever trigger. It makes me think of, and now I'm not an expert on this, it was only brought to my attention a few years ago. In traditional Judaism, there's a practice of having scrolls from the Torah like rolled up and put in things in doorways, like on door frames, and then you touch them every time you go through, and there's a thought behind that relating to the message that's inscribed therein. So it's that kind of practice, because we frequently move through doorways. That's a very good chaining or sort of a leapfrogging opportunity for other habits, and then using that as a good way to reflect on the preceding 15 minutes or so is that's very. I think I might actually just start implementing that right away, because a lot of the time I find that I only reflect on an interaction much later, and I realize that I was totally not present, and that caused me to have some negative impact that I wouldn't have had if I was more present in the conversation.
Yeah, it's surprising the effect that they can have, just to tighten the loop of your life there. You are noticing much quicker if you are being a bit of an asshole. You're also noticing maybe your emotions in that situation, and you're even asking yourself, am I being let's just say true to my values? Am I inhabiting the identity that I really want to right now? Or is this a useful way to be engaging right now? All of those questions can come up. So I found it to be an intriguing possibility that I haven't quite nailed yet, but I'm very interested in.
So anyone who's into sort of prediction markets and the research behind it is probably aware of the principle that disciplines that have more instantaneous feedback, or more regular feedback and more measurable feedback, are much less prone to wild speculation, and the experts are much better at predicting outcomes. So you've got your sort of like economists, your macroeconomists, and they especially the pundit kinds, who can just make any sort of prediction and always justify anything, and in retrospect as well. But then you've got things, sort of, say, mathematics, for instance, or a best example is a bit closer to home for you would be like surgery. If you make a mistake, you have instantaneous feedback from 100 different variables, and you do, a surgeon who's well trained and popular and in a busy city will do the same operation multiple times, maybe every day for years, and you have instant feedback all the time. So this idea of tightening the feedback loop means that you can, more quickly update the weights of your mental models and improve and minimize your loss function, so to speak. But at the same time, it might also have the effect of increasing the meaning in one's life. Time seems to fly when you lose track, and that's great in some ways. And when you're working, when you get into a flow state, it's wonderful. Yes. But in terms of interactions and social interactions, I think it's terrible when you feel like your time with someone just flies by, and you only were present for like a few moments. The rest of it, you were kind of just on autopilot. You were there and you were engaged, but you weren't aware of it. And so, like, tightening those feedback loops in terms of one's awareness actually fills in life with a much higher resolution of meaning and awareness. And a year is longer than a year in some sense. The tighter those feedback loops are, up to a point, of course, I would imagine.
Yeah, but that's one of the big reasons I'm actually trying to do this. As you say, it's so easy to slip into this unconscious day-to-day sort of similar pattern of being.
I really like that trigger as well, though, with the door frames. I definitely, because that's something I'd never thought of doing before. It's a really nice one. I'm going to explore that a bit.
Oh, excellent. I wanted to actually ask, so I mean, we've gone on this sort of long loop of talking about time. and the various ways of being in it. So if we go all the way back to the beginning, and we were talking about things that you just have to schedule in, and you mentioned scheduling in sunrises. So are there any other things that you, like right now, what are you scheduling in, if I had to ask you?
So there's, so sort of the most macro level, there's a yearly review, which I think is crucial every year. Right. And using that to plan for the future and create goals and break those down into the habits that form them and chain those to existing habits and so on. Then, I like to do a sort of smaller version of that every quarter, because I think that's a nice duration for many reasons. But we can get into that some other time. And then in terms of the more obscure sorts of things, I do a weekly review as well, and in that I've incorporated a lot of activities. So I review my personal data for the last week. So this is like I use the app Rescue Time that tracks all the time I've spent on my computer and what applications or websites I was using, so that I have a pretty good sense of how productive I was being. So it knows which ones are productive and unproductive, and gives me a score. So I look at that data from the last week, and I look at another app that tracks how much coding I do and in what languages and in what projects. Review my financial status and transactions and things like that. So there's a bit of data review, which is just useful because you're not just reviewing it at a macro scale every now and then and sort of analyzing it. You're also in it, and just looking at it and being aware and being more mindful is useful in and of itself. And then there's a bunch of other behaviors there. So I will review I've got two lists. One's a waiting for list, which is just, right, anything that I'm waiting for, whether it's someone to return something that I've loaned them, or, whatever it may be. And then the other one is a someday list, which is just a list. And every time I'm like, someday I'd like to, live in that city, or someday I'd like to go skydiving, whatever it may be, that goes on the someday list. And every week I review that just to sort of bring those things back into my working memory, so to speak, or my medium-term memory, and just keep them as a point of awareness, and also to check off ones I've completed, and if you just make them more of an intention than they otherwise would be if you write them down somewhere and never review them. So there's a few things like that. And then in terms of, I have tried over the years to schedule things like, okay, in the next quarter I have to see one sunrise, draw one sketch, write one song. I've tried systems like that. I've just found that I was always overly ambitious, and then I'd feel guilty about it, and it would make it more of a chore than anything else. So I think finding the right balance for me with that is always a challenge. So there's the website Higher Existence, and they have it's 50 life challenges or something like that, and you sort of level up in each tier. So you've got the meditation tier, which is starts 5 minutes or 1 minute a day or something like that, and it levels up until you can meditate 2 hours every day. It's got the social tier, where you start with pay one stranger a compliment every day, and then it goes all the way up to meet someone new every weekend, or whatever it may be. So they really do level up. So there are things that I've tried to incorporate like that, but nothing's stuck very well, other than these things that I tend to do at a weekly granularity. So I'm interested to hear what you have to say on that, and sort of what ideas we may give each other, because I think a lot of the time one might get 80 or 90% of the way to a really good system to implement something, but just misses the other bits, and when you've got someone else to bounce the ideas off, you can actually complete a lot of the puzzle.
Yeah, that's probably something worthwhile looking. I think for me, I've been thinking about, as we mentioned briefly, these activities that are not naturally space filling. And so obviously the daily meditation practice is something that I'm really making sure I'm carving out time for. I guess what I'm also looking for is more and more trying to carve out meaningful slots of time with, for example, my brother, and spending time really talking to him. So I've been thinking a lot about all the conversations that are possible, like in possibility space, and all the things that you like really would want to know about someone you are close to, and yet that myself and I imagine at least most other people will just never have. So I mean, and some of these, I mean, these range from the frankly cliched, such as like what do you like really, let's say, just dream about, or to maybe some of the more intimate, their thoughts on maybe a partner, or if they're really getting satisfaction out of a current job, and why, and what it is that they feel they are meant to be doing at this stage in their life. But you can even get more uncomfortable, and I mean here uncomfortable in the good way, the same way that like really good exercise is uncomfortable. I think that there's a level of conversation which you can access, but it really comes through. It really comes through having these difficult conversations. It reminds me of a quote, actually. I think it goes something like, a good measure of success in life is just the amount of uncomfortable conversations you're willing to have and uncomfortable situations you're willing to endure. Something like that. I think that's worth figuring out where it came from. So I'm trying to think of a good example. Maybe you have one off the top of your head.
Of an uncomfortable situation that was beneficial.
Not okay. So that would be interesting, but I'm specifically thinking of topics of conversation which, just for maybe polite society reasons, and because we don't have the emotional elasticity all the time to get into it with people, but we just avoid routinely. I'm trying to think like.
I'll throw out a flag there, and it's anything that ends in genics, like eugenics, cryogenics. Those are pretty good topics that are super interesting and are just like taboo words. But yeah, I think you mean more in terms of a social sense of like you don't necessarily like ask people about loved ones that are sick or deceased or things like that, and like the relationship that no one wants to bring up things that are obviously painful, but yet they're so intrinsically linked to people's identity and history, and have resulted in many ways in where they are in their lives and how they view the world.
Yeah, something like that, right? I think I need to clearly go and sit down and pass my thoughts here, but there just seems like possibility space is far bigger and far greater and far more interesting than what we are confined to just by social convention and habit. And I mean, this could just reflect my own inadequacies as of yet of just making good conversation quickly. And of course, we don't always have the time or attention or emotional latency to do this, but that's something I'm thinking about doing more and more. Something else that I intend to schedule in more time is just like low intensity walking in sunlight in nature on my own. It's something which is so easy to put off, but I find it has a disproportionate benefit on clarity, mood, and idea generation.
Yeah, walking and thinking, the physical landscape extends the mental landscape. It's like you're using all the space around you as extra computing power. It's uncanny. I've just realized that that's something I haven't really had for a while now, because I was walking to varsity or taking a bus ride and a walk, and now I drive to and from work every day, so I'm getting very little of that, and I just realized that that's probably that's something that I've definitely missed, but I haven't really put the conscious thought to it. I mean, I find listening to podcasts or audiobooks when walking is fantastic, but I also just walking quietly and with nothing, and just being in your own thoughts. Actually, I'm gonna move that up my list of things that are most beneficial in life, like as habits that one can cultivate. Because now that I think about it, a large percentage of my daily routine for the years that I was a student was walking quite long distances, mostly on my own, either listening to audiobooks or podcasts, or just thinking to myself. And the value of that is, it's undeniably shaped my identity more than anything else that really filled the same amount of time, I'd say.
That's. Can you point out anything specific that came out of that? Which aspects of your identity?
My strategizing about future prospects, the future of our species, and what role I wanted to play in that. It's almost like the whole 80,000 hours type approach of looking at how you can have the biggest positive impact on the world and be happy and successful at the same time. And a lot of my time was spent thinking about the world and assembling all of it. And especially after varsity, you've learned a whole bunch of things for the day, and then you kind of combine them into your world model, and then seeing how you fit into that. And obviously university is such an important time for forming one's identity as well. And I think that all came together for me on the sum of all of those walks. It was just like a way for me to update my mental model, and something about being out in the world depersonalizes it and makes it more of a mental exercise whereby you feel your connection to everything else.
That's really interesting. But there's actually something to that in several aspects, actually. The one that I would say, and I think that you and I probably both suffer from this a little bit, is just constant input. So, I know that in my priority ranking, I'm much more likely to open up the next podcast instead of maybe taking let's say the remaining 10 minutes of a drive in silence to try and integrate what I just learned. So I guess the walks in that way are like a forcing function that just ensure that you are going to sit and integrate for a bit. And that's something that I worry about more and more, is I'm at almost capacity for intake, and yet synthesis, output, and reflection are getting cast to the wayside, I think.
Finding that balance is so hard. And I think it's less about finding the balance acutely and more about finding it in the long term, at a lower resolution. So I think having long periods of time where you're just reading intensely and listening and learning and absorbing, and then long periods of time where you kind of shut yourself off a bit and you just produce and create and ponder. I think that's a good way to go about it at the level of weeks or months. As a student, that was kind of more of a natural thing, because your time demands swing so heavily from sort of month to month, depending on whether it's a vacation or it's test time or it's project time or it's just lectures. It's a little bit different as one gets older and one's daily sort of activities are more uniform. But yeah, absolutely. I think being at one's bandwidth limit for inputs is a danger, especially for you and I and our ilk. It's a real concern. So do you have any good ways of remedying that? Because other than just not using a cell phone, which would be a very effective way of doing it, what ways do you have?
I must my bandwidth limits are not because of cell phones. It's more like, I guess, okay, it's the podcast part, yes. So maybe I'm ignoring a crucial part there. I don't know. I haven't got this right yet. I know that I continually write when I do take a little bit of time to reflect that I want to spend more time creating or outputting or synthesizing. But it's just, for me at least, I have a little bit of an information addiction. And so I know that it's so easy for me to get stuck into the next book. And because there are always essentially infinite books after that are interesting and worth your time, it's very difficult to pick a cutoff point. So I think maybe I'm going to have to put in some rules. I'm always thinking or looking for a rule that will actually take some decision making away from me.
Yeah. So maybe we should take I want to say a page out of the book, but it's probably a bad metaphor here, from one of my favorite books, which is Algorithms to Live By, and look at it as an actual real bandwidth problem. So what do you do when you've got too much signal or too many packets, sort of get towards a node on a network? Well, you can buffer them to some extent, which I think we both already do. We have like a capture system for books and podcasts, so, and articles. So if you recommend me an article, it usually goes into Pocket, and that just buffer stacks up, and periodically I'll just delete things because I'm never going to get around to them, and I only keep like the 20% that I think are the most valuable. So that's kind of like a kind of buffer, I suppose. And then Goodreads is a buffer on what you read. Every recommendation goes into the one to read, but you only read some from there.
Yes.
So there's buffers, and then another thing would be throttling, I suppose, where you limit the rate at which data can flow to a more manageable level. The real world application of that is a little bit more difficult. We'll get back to that, and then I suppose another thing you would have is actually something that they look at the book in detail, which is how transferring data over the TCP/IP protocol. You have this, you make a connection and you start sending packets, and if the packets are received, you have an additive increase, so you just keep sending them faster and faster and faster while you're still having them being received successfully. And then as soon as they stop getting received successfully, as soon as one is dropped, then you have a multiplicative decrease. It's additive increase, multiplicative decrease. So you like halve the rate at which it's flowing. And they go into, good reasons and the mathematics to some extent of why this is the case. But it's very effective, and they map that to the real world to some extent. So I don't know, could we map that, less so to email and the sorts of things that they looked at, and more to our problem of input coming from podcasts and YouTube videos and stuff that's valuable, books, but which can be overwhelming? This would be how I would do it. So I would say I would peg it to my feeling of overwhelm. So if I'm feeling like I'm not understanding things well, or maybe I'm feeling just harassed almost by the sheer volume of things that I want to get to, then so whilst I'm this increasing function and trying more and more things, as soon as, maybe you could link it, as soon as you feel overwhelmed, you completely halve your input, and you have to spend then half of your time reflecting or not taking any audio. So you have to drive in silence, let's say, for podcasts, or you have to walk in silence, or I don't know what I would do with my Kindle, but not read it. Yeah, exactly.
That's a bit like chopping off my hand.
Do you take it with you wherever you go? Like whenever you're carrying a bag or something?
Yeah, that's basically been my habit. Is
interesting.
If I have my bag, I tend to have my Kindle. I also just try to find things with pockets that are big enough for it, so that it's even closer to hand. I find
it's a struggle in summer.
It is a struggle in summer, but my new motto is it's never too hot for jeans. This is a dogma I will live and die by.
You'll fight on that hill to the death.
Exactly. I wanted to actually, so I guess, when we were speaking about all of this, the underlying thing, and this was actually going to be my next point, something else that I schedule in or try to, is just time to think is something that I have on this list in my head. Because I don't know about you, but we both interact with a lot of really smart and interesting people, and all the time, right? We're having people say things like, "Oh, I think about this quite a lot," or "I thought about that," or "What do you think about it?" And yet, I think we're playing a word game there, right? I mean, we're saying the word "think" and having this mental image of someone, sitting down and pounding through solution space and considering alternatives and trying to reject their hypothesis, or maybe if you're a bit of idealistic. And in reality, we're essentially getting what Yudkowsky would call cached answers, right? And so scheduling...
And we just have a lot of those because we've taken in a lot of input from a lot of sources. So we actually can't think for rocks.
Real time to think is something which I think gives disproportionate returns, both because it's so rarely done and because you are doing a combined synthesis, analysis, summary, and because it's just it's a sparse resource.
So I have some links into that because that's a very, very good point. This ties back to some things that I forgot to mention earlier with like when I'm doing the weekly review, and another thing that I wanted to mention about when you say scheduling stuff, which is time blocking, to actually physically put stuff in the calendar and like see it all there. It's like sleeping and commuting time and all of that, and then physically blocking out in the calendar time for social commitments and exercise and things like that, because that makes them equal to any formal commitments that one might have in there, and you will be able to defend them more significantly, and that I found is very successful. But I try and do that. So when I do my weekly review, the last thing on the list is to look ahead, and in that I schedule workouts, meeting times with collaborators for projects I'm working on, whatever they may be. I block out deep work if I'm working on some project, outside of like work hours or something like that, and when I'm going to try and work on it. I plan my sort of social commitments, and I try and plan some like social sport. But then the one of the things on there is actually at the top of the list is a think session, and I put it in capital letters. And it's a time to just sit and think. And I feel like it was the authors of Freakonomics, when they wrote the follow-up, which was Think Like a Freak. They said that one of the things was just to sit and spend time just thinking with no stimulus or topic or anything. And I think that stuck with me for years, and I always try and schedule it. That said, I very seldom actually, like I will always end up moving these think sessions or distracting myself or delaying it, and then something comes up, and I'm very bad about defending that. So I definitely need a bit of strategy about defending it, but I think the idea of actually scheduling it is good. I just maybe need to tweak it in some way to make it more defensible, like chain it to some reward or something. But also just before that, on the weekly review, other things I have is I review my I have lists in Evernote called Eureka, and I have one on my laptop called Brain Dump. Essentially, they're just lists of when I think of an idea, and I'm like, oh, that's a great idea, but I can't like pursue that right at this instant. I just make a note of it, and it like gets backed up to the cloud, and then I can expunge it from my mind. So it's not distracting me, but it's at the same time it's like captured, whether I do something with that or not. So just getting rid of it for starters is valuable, because now it's not distracting you anymore. But then I can review them later, and it's an amazing like repository over time. Whenever you're stuck and go, I don't have a good idea, like there's just like a wealth of these. So I've like automated that to a large extent, and that's I found like very, very useful. So even when I'm trying to like avoid technology, if I'm like trying to study or something and I don't have my phone, I'll have a piece of paper next to me that's just for like, because suddenly as soon as you have to study, you just become a treasure trove of amazing project ideas and brilliant inventions, and as one does, like I literally can fill like an A4 sheet of paper with ideas I have while trying to study before I fill an A4 sheet with notes. And so it's an amazing way to just get it out of your mind, and then you can review it later, and looking at those things just connects so many synapses. So that also ties into sort of every week I'm reviewing these things, and then also reviewing which projects I'm working on, and I sometimes add the ideas to my project or make a project out of an idea, and so that is almost like scheduling time to think, or to think about ideas once had, or explore novel ideas further, because they're super valuable, but often ephemeral and often like distracting and then forgotten.
Well, I think, Gianluca, as usual, we have found ways to converge even closer to just doing almost exactly the same things. I mean, I have almost an identical sort of repository of ideas that I, as you say, just to dump it out of your brain, even if you think it's good but don't have the energy to pursue it. That is something that I make some reasonable use of. And like you, I'm seeing more and more that I should just be scheduling and defending these thinking sessions. But they are we need to have a term here for the opposite of those space filling events, because these are like space minimizing events. These shrink like to nothing of their own volition, because you're just far more likely to put them off as, oh well, how much value am I really going to get out of this? I don't know if that's the problem, but for several reasons, they are easy to ignore.
Totally. Like spending quality time with family is like one that's like quite easy to squash, or like that thinking time or meditating time, or then exercise. There's quite a few, and they're just so easy to squash when other things run. Yeah, it's,
exactly.
So you've got the expanders and the collapses, maybe, or the expanders and the constrictors. So we'll
Eric,
put it in the show
time
notes.
we will get some terminology that is worthy of your attention, and then we will send that on.
Create a graphic, write an article about it, and popularize it. You want to get to the point where old Joe is like, hey, Jamie, bring that up. What was that thing about the time expanding and contracting? Jamie, bring that up. Have you seen this shit?
Exactly.
Have you seen this? It's fantastic. And I love how like half of his guests are just like totally surprised when that happens.
Yes.
Like Roger Penrose, like they bring up some like diagram or something during the thing, and he's like, oh, there it is. He's like so taken aback. He's like, well, they've actually bothered to do it live. It's like, this is why you have a producer in the room. And presumably also because they do it live, but probably with some 7-second delay in case someone says something and it's like, no shit, we can't say that, cut that. I presume they don't go live, they go like soft live. There's some delay. I think you have to, dude. I don't think at that scale with people who are, I don't know, although people go live on TV, but I think even then there's always like a 7-second threshold. Like if someone just starts swearing and whatever, you have 7 seconds that before you can cut them before it actually goes live. I don't know. I thought that was just like a standard practice with live things, but like I would not want to do a live recording of just about anything. Like I think that's terrifying, especially not an interview, because you can do so much in an edit. I think also just being a decent editor in terms of video and knowing how much an edit can make the thing that you're capturing. Like it's just like the temptation is overwhelming. But yeah, coming back to expanders and contractors, growers and shrinkers, the flaccid and the turgid.
Yeah. No, that's not the right
growers
terminology.
And the slowers. Yeah. Well, this is the problem: is humans love lists that are like 3, 5, 10, 12 items long, and humans love things that have strong like alliteration or good like patterns to the rhythm of them. And so a lot of the sage advice that we remember is just like because it's catchy, not because it's like 100% accurate. So if you can ever find something that has a really catchy name that people can remember, that's also like highly accurate, I mean, that's a gold mine. I think that's one of the things one should just genuinely sit down and think about, is like good names for things, or good like breakdowns of things that fit nicely into the buckets that humans remember well. Like things in threes are so well remembered.
That's very true. And I guess there's this is a topic which comes up often between us and some people we talk to, is that idea of the debt that's incurred when you generate new knowledge, but generate it in a form in which it is very difficult for others to use, right? I mean, so we've talked about this in the context of like research papers in some fairly difficult topics. But I guess this applies to almost anything, right? I mean, if you are writing a blog post on how to get a girlfriend and you spend 20 more minutes thinking about how to summarize your approach into a catchy little triad, you are making that knowledge more accessible to the world, and that's
as long as you're doing it in a way that accurately maps back to the original space, like the output space. It must be as much as possible a lossless compression. And so I mean, humans are so wired to think of things in certain patterns. It's like the best example, I think, is commonly misremembered sayings.
All right.
So are you feeling lucky, punk? Or things like that are actually not, or Luke, I am your father. Like, all of these things are well remembered by people, but none of them were ever actually said. They were quite different from that, and so the reason why people remember them like that is because it fits a pattern of memorable things. So the book Elements of Eloquence goes into this very deeply.
Yeah.
But particularly, like, humans have this thing. If you say, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? And the guy goes, practice, man, practice. Like, that's so much more memorable than just practice. Things that have symmetry and certain patterns that link with the way we speak and the way we think. And it's true in alliteration. It's true in the meter of the things that we say in just everywhere. And you can find, like, the most well remembered. The name's Bond, James Bond. Like that is entirely a result of the form. If you can fit the function within a profound form, you've done a true service to humanity. And I think, like, some of the greatest authors out there are people who've just combined other people's ideas, or even not even combined, maybe just presented them in a way that's much more accessible. And I think that is actually incredibly valuable and incredibly underrated.
Do you have any particular favorite examples of that kind of thing? For me, I think the book that you mentioned earlier in this episode, Algorithms to Live By, I think gives an excellent treatment of some aspects of, like, theoretical computer science for basically anyone. I mean, I don't think you really need to have much more than, like, what would you say, high school mathematics, if that. Yeah,
and the kind of inquisitive mind that might be informed. I was reluctant to mention that because I have the background, so it would be hard for me to say, it's suitable for the layperson, because I don't know that it actually would be. So there's a bias there. And I'll think of like 7 of these tonight in bed while I'm trying to fall asleep. But
you should not be. You need to think about other things in bed, my friend. I'll be thinking about the fact that I have a bed now. I'll be.
Yeah, there we go. You're not going to be sleeping on the floor. I mean, just reflecting on that is incredible. So yeah, I think yeah, through the years there are, some people have both. Like I feel like a Sam Harris. Maybe he's not the most quotable guy, but he's very good at expressing ideas as well as, to a large extent, synthesize. Like, he is synthesizing ideas based on combining others. He's not just like telling you about meditation or about rationality or any of these things. Eliezer's actually quite bad a lot of the time at making. I think he produces ideas at such a rate, and it's like was it Blaise Pascal who said, I'm sorry my letter couldn't be shorter, I didn't have, I'm sorry the letter's so long I didn't have time to make it shorter.
Yes, that's
this idea. That's it's I think like with Eliezer in the sequences, Eliezer Yudkowsky, for anyone who's not already baptized into the less wrong world. In the sequences, he's writing like an article a day. And so it's about volume, then about, sort of precision or refinement or iteration. It's almost like a product cycle. You iterate on it to make it better. And I think when you look at, like, print books, there's a lot more of that, and poetry is the most of that you get. That's the utter extreme. Less so in some incarnations, but yeah, a lot of those well remembered lines are from poems, because that's what a poem is. It's focusing most of one's energy not on the idea but on how to say the idea well. It's ideas that we've all had, just well put.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Sorry, Sasha's she's having like severe toothaches, so she needs her wisdom's out. So I think that's why she's a bit of a sad girl at the moment. I was just trying to console her.
That's not not ideal. When wisdoms are another maladaptation of humans. Like we don't need extra teeth for grinding up fibrous vegetables, or an appendix to make them less dangerous. I don't know. What is the appendix even for? It was something like that, right? It was like a bacterial...
I think, if I remember correctly, the textbooks, they all say that it's just put there to kill some percentage of children. That's why it's there.
No,
it's just its own form of population control. It's
like
really slow and ineffective. Yeah, it was the only organ that joined the book club where they read Better Never to Have Been, and then it was like, cool, I'm in.
I feel like there's some great pun on the term vestigial organ, but it's not coming to me. I can feel it there, but I can't catch it. It's like my net's too porous.
It's too porous.
My net's too porous. I mean, it makes sense, but it's just it's not cached.
Cached replies. No, that is.
But the human brain works on caching. It would be impossible without it. As I now realize, trying to do queries on a 1 terabyte SQL database.
The thing is, though, in some ways, I find that a highly liberating idea. So, I mean, I guess for anyone who listens to this and is unfamiliar with the idea of a cached reply, it's just that I think when Eliezer Yudkowsky, in this particular essay, he derives this from just the physical limitations of computation in the human brain. But basically, if you are...
Like the processing speed of neurons.
Yes. And so... if you are generating a sufficiently complex answer in a really short time, then you can be pretty much certain that it's physically impossible for your brain to have done any novel computing of that information in that time. So you know that instead it's just doing a memory call and bringing up whatever cached answer you have there. So I find this fairly not limiting, but liberating, because it gives a good source of novelty once you're aware of that tendency, and you know that people have this sort of psychological tendency to use their cached answers. Then you could become this sort of fountain of novelty and intrigue just by doing the extra work to say, okay, that was my cached response, what's my real response? And then using that as maybe a call to think.
Absolutely. Or to update or deliberately, spend time changing one's cached thoughts. I mean, this is the kind of thing that happens when you listen to someone on a podcast or in some kind of interview or something, and they just seem like this treasure trove of information and original ideas on every topic. And it's just because their cached thoughts, they're just recalling, but their cached thoughts are, well developed and highly dissimilar to everyone else's cached thoughts, but still make sense when you go and follow the causal logic manually, back to sort of the premises. And so, one might even say that, rationality is almost just the discipline of using deliberate thought to update and refine one's cached thoughts in this sort of feedback loop that just improves itself.
I guess we really do want better cached thoughts. We want to improve our default state and our default set of replies, and that is the work of a lifetime, right? That is, in some sense, your memorized solutions when you want memorized solutions.
100%. Yeah, and this is like it's similar to the idea of, you know, the atomic habits idea. You do the habits, or you know, you form your identity as the kind of person who then does those habits every day, and then those add up to change over time. It's not the other way. It's not the inverse, right? So you become the kind of person who cares about the truth, and as a result, you think deeply about things, and your cached thoughts then become formed around more accurate models of reality. And so over time, you become the kind of person whose immediate response is more truthful and more accurate. That's the hypothesis.
And I guess identifying that hypothesis in possibility space was, well, it was either a cached thought or it was some novel generation. So,
tying a few of the ideas we've had this evening together, the terminology, you know, something space, is an interesting one. I think it's, and maybe this is just my own experience, but I find it's a very effective way to convey ideas to someone else who's familiar with ideas of a similar kind, or who's familiar with the concept. Right. But it's very ineffective at conveying ideas to people who aren't. Right? So if you talk to someone who's like familiar with machine learning and you talk about idea space, that makes so much sense. It's a very good spatial analogy, and humans are good at, you know, that spatial understanding. But when you know, it's literally the space of it. When you talk to someone who's not familiar with that terminology, you just lose them immediately. And I was a person who didn't use that terminology. We should probably explain what we mean by that. But now we're going to have the inferential distances problem, so we should probably explain what we mean by that. But you know, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So seeing as how you're digging into it lately, go ahead and explain X space.
Okay.
Not space X.
I guess like the formalism comes from linear algebra, but how you can think about it is that, let's think of a concrete example here. Let's think of different kinds of dog, right? We call that dog space. And essentially all that refers to, right, is each different kind of dog could be represented as a direction in some space. So, I mean, this could have more than the 3 dimensions that we think of intuitively, but you only have to be able to think of it abstractly. Let's just imagine that the only dogs were German Shepherds, Cocker Spaniels, and Beagles, right? So that would be a 3-dimensional space, right? But now you can see how you could easily have more dimensions. You could add in Jack Russells or whatever. And so a point in space there would be, let's say you had a dog that was a combination, you know, 1/3 German Shepherd, 1/3 Beagle, and 1/3 Cocker Spaniel. It would plot to that point in space, and at this point it was 0 Jack Russell. And so when we say thing space or idea space, we're really talking about the set of all possible outcomes of that property, I want to say. I don't know, you bring in maybe some technicality or some rigor here, because and then I think the other thing which would be fun to try and do is maybe we should try and complete Elias's challenge of how short of an explanation of short inferential distances can you give. But let's save that for just after.
Yeah.
But yeah, add some rigor to what I was just saying if you were.
While you... Yeah, so I was thinking about this today during my commute while listening to a podcast, because, you know, multiprocessing, which for the record is impossible for the human brain. Ish. So, yeah, ish. Like the driving and thinking, that's multiprocessing we can do. The thinking and thinking, not so much. But I was thinking about this very thing, and that I've thought about that idea because I you know, wasn't always familiar with the terminology, like the concepts behind it I've, you know, had for a while, but I just hadn't made like the 2 or 3, like, and maybe it wasn't even inferential steps. I wasn't familiar with using the terminology of something space, and now I find myself using it all the time, and it's probably from digging into machine learning. But it's very useful for people who get it, and it's very bad at describing and explaining things. That's a terrible analogy for people who aren't familiar with it. So I was thinking about how best one can convey this simply and effectively, which is very challenging. But one of the ideas I came up with was to go, okay, cool, keep it to 2 dimensions, because people can very easily visualize that. Like even 3 starts to become tricky, because now you still have to use your hands and whatever. So keep it to 2D. So think about if we have a group of people and we want to collect 2 pieces of information about each person. We want to collect their weight, their body mass, and their height. And now what we do is we go and we take down these 2 measurements of each person, and now we want to represent those measurements. So naturally we can draw a graph of like the relationship between weight and height. So you've got weight on the x-axis and height on the y-axis, and you've literally just got like a chart. And now you can draw a point that represents some person, right? So you look at their weight on the x-axis, you move along with your finger until you get to the weight that they are, and then you move up on the y-axis until you get to the height that they are, and you draw a little dot, right? And you can do that for each person. Now you've got a whole bunch of dots, right? So our space of our person space, looking only at those 2 attributes, is the area that is made by the square. So it's the square that's made by those 2 sides, or the rectangle that's made by. That's a physical space, right? And if you were to just drop a pencil onto that page, and it would hit some random point, that corresponds to some weight and some height, some x and some y value, right? So every point like that in that space corresponds to a pair of measurements that could represent some human. Right? Okay. So the sample that we had might not be one of those points, but all of those points could possibly be some sample. And then you get into why this is useful, which would be, well, you maybe start seeing that there's like clusters of these dots in your space, right? And so one cluster would be like people who are lean and healthy and athletic, and you would notice that part of your sample group separated from the people who were unhealthy and overweight, because they, you'd have a cluster, if weight's on the x-axis, bottom right corner, you've sort of got people who are short and heavy, and then your sort of like middle and top left, you've got people who are, for their height, quite low weight. So, and essentially you'd have clusters, and you could separate them into 2 groups of people. But this idea of a space, it's actually a physical space. It's just the more features you have, the more different things like weight and height, the more measurements you're taking for each person, the more dimensions you have in your space. And as soon as you 3, it's now a cube. It's still a space. It's now a volume. And then you can go 4 dimension, 5 dimension, 6 dimension. You can just keep adding. Now you can't visualize it, but the principles still apply. The simplest kind of version, I suppose, would be like a Venn diagram. You can talk about like possibility space. It's like the big circle, and then you've got like, like a circle that overlaps with that, and then the spaces actually represent possible things that can exist and things with inside those things. So I'm thinking of metaphors like that to try and explain it, because once someone gets that idea, it's so useful. Like explaining really the idea of possibility space is a great way to explain the concept of like the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. There's all these finely tuned variables in our universe, so there must be a God, because otherwise, how could it be so finely tuned? The odds of it happening are so small. And it's like, well, only in a universe where those things all happen to be in that way would, intelligent life have arisen to remark on how unlikely that is. It's like shooting at a target or shooting at a wall from, hundreds of yards away, and then you go and draw a target around the bullet hole, and you see, I'm a perfect sharpshooter, and that's where the name comes from. But the idea of considering the possible, space of all universes that could exist, that's a great example of, now if the person has an idea of universe space, now they have an idea of, okay, cool, it's unlikely, but only in some part of that universe space would intelligent life even be able to like reflect on that.
Yeah, I like that.
And now I've stalled enough for you. and it's your go at explaining short inferential
I think
steps.
I can do this. I'm cautiously optimistic. Okay, so let's do this. So what we're referencing here is the fact that Eliezer Yudkowsky wrote an essay called, I think it was called Expecting Short Inferential Distances. And part of that essay, he basically said that this concept is very difficult to explain in a shorter length than the one that he used. So I'm going to try and beat him, and wish me luck. Basically, when we explain things to people, we assume more shared knowledge than is actually likely. And the reason for this, at least Eliezer Yudkowsky posits, is an evolutionary one, in that for however many thousands of years we were tribal, all of the possible facts that we were likely to discover, new facts, for example, of new food sources or the new location of some feature of interest, were explainable to other members of our tribe, and just mentioning the new fact was enough in and of itself to explain its significance. You did not have to explain to hominids with our own evolutionary histories why water might be important or why food might be important. And so Yudkowsky posits, because we have evolved and spent so much time in settings where we are used to explaining something and not having to explain all the reasoning behind that, we now find ourselves in the situation where a very involved argument, an academic one or something in a journal paper, might have several hundred, call them prerequisites and background knowledge, and what Yudkowsky ultimately calls inferential steps, as in steps that explain why the previous mentioned fact is important and true. You know, I don't have to explain to you why you need calories. Your body takes care of that reasoning. When you explain the theory of evolution, there are several inferential steps that you're assuming, and you can do that safely. Let's say if the person is, has a scientific background, but you can't be so sure for large swaths of just planet Earth, unfortunately. And yet those inferential steps, right, those reasons to believe evolution is true, are no less true and no less valuable, but easy to neglect because of this ancient sort of bias of expecting that everyone shares our common tribal knowledge because that is all there is.
That was a pretty solid effort. Like I'd give you a first for that.
Oh, thank you. I was going to say
you just scraped a first class
B-
mark on that.
Yeah.
It's pretty good. It did follow Yudkowsky's sort of trajectory that he takes in the post, but it's because the post is very, very good. I think that's probably my favorite of all of his. It's a standout, which is saying a lot. And he uses that, and the conclusion is fantastic as well. He's like, and if you think you can explain all of this to an audience, briefly, just as an intro before your actual talk, then you're sadly mistaken, and you're going to come up against the very problem itself. But yeah, another way to just think of inferential steps is to kind of look at, like, if you were to start at things that everyone can observe around you, like there's a water bottle on the desk in front of you, say, and get to some conclusion like humans evolved from a common ancestor. It's the number of therefores on that page that you would have is the number of inferential steps, in other words.
Okay,
and it's a proxy, because we tend to not do one inferential step at a time. We tend to take leaps when we actually use the word therefore. But yeah, essentially there's a water bottle on the desk, and therefore there's water inside the bottle, and therefore there's common lineage, and therefore we have a common ancestor. And so each time you have to go A equals B and B equals C, therefore A equals C. That's an inferential step. And when you chain those together, you get these complex theories, because it's like a network, that all of these different inferences can all connect together and converge on nodes in the network. But yeah, that was a pretty good batch. I think if we can explain the concepts of space and inferential steps effectively, it would bode very well for us in future discussions, arguments, presentations.
Yeah. Well, I certainly, I was a doubter, but once you explained to me how this water bottle on my desk proves that evolution is, it gives it a credence much higher than it had before.
Just as a warning before anything else, is you should never start with the thing at the top of the page and the thing at the bottom of the page and try and fill in the gaps. It's terrible. And university education and school education even tell us to do that a lot of the time. Like learning to do proof by induction. I always started with the conclusion. I mean, they tell you to do that, right? Essentially, like prove this using this, and I literally would write the conclusion at the bottom and then fill in the steps, because you might get part marks. But that is a very bad rationalist move, and any self-respecting person who values truth should not actually follow that approach. You should start with some observation and move to a conclusion, and you shouldn't know what conclusion you're going to hit until you do. Anyway, I think we've delved very deeply into spaces, and we've inferred and we've discussed memorable lines. And what else have we dug into? We've dug into habits, things that are worth scheduling.
We came away with some new ones.
Activities that expand and activities that contract.
Yeah.
And we need names for them. So if any of our listeners want to write into us and suggest names,
yeah, write in the mail. We check that often.
Yeah.
I think for me at least, what I'm taking away from this is just I need to schedule in that thinking time and that walking alone time. That's a big one for me.
Absolutely, yeah. I need to re-inject that into my life, and find some good, concrete, actionable ways to do that. So that's definitely something I'm going to work on, and noticing and reflecting every time I walk through a doorway as much as possible. That's another little one that you brought to my attention that I'll be exploring. But yeah, it's been a very good, meandering, tangential discussion, and those are the best kinds.
Yes, I couldn't agree more.
It's been great chatting.
Excellent. Thank you, sir.
Cool. Until the next one.
Thanks for listening to the Bit of a Tangent podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please get in touch with us and share your thoughts. You can email us at podtangent@gmail.com. That's POD tangent@gmail.com, or connect with us on Twitter through the handle @podtangent. For more information about us, our backgrounds, and other projects we're involved in, visit our website at podtangent.com. The best ways to support us are to share one of our episodes with someone who might enjoy them, or give us a rating and review on iTunes. That way, Apple knows that we're actually worth listening to, and all the platforms that pull content from them will know this as well. Gianluca and I both love having these discussions, and we relish the opportunity to share ideas with like-minded people around the world. Your support and listenership are sincerely appreciated. Until next time.